1820. Radar lost. 629. Wreckage found. In between, a voice chose immortality. The Piper Comanche cuts through the darkness over Camden, Tennessee, its single engine humming against the March wind like a prayer being torn apart. Inside, four souls sit unaware that in precisely 13 minutes they will become legend. Patsy Cline adjusts her seatbelt and stares into the black void, her fingers unconsciously tracing the scar along her forehead. Honey over broken glass, beauty built on pain. She sang against thunder her whole life. Tonight the thunder sings back. At 30 years old, she has transformed personal devastation into public triumph more times than anyone should have to. Her voice, liquid honey poured over broken glass, has made her the undisputed queen of country music. But tonight, March 5th, 1963, she carries with her an unsealed letter to her mother. Don't worry if I don't come back. I've had a good life. Ew. The words flutter against her purse as the small aircraft shudders through another violent gust. Randy Hughes, her manager-turned-pilot, wrestles with controls that seem determined to betray him. Rain hammers the windshield like bullets from heaven, and the altimeter needle dances a death waltz. Behind them, Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins joke nervously. But Patsy remains silent, listening to something only she can hear. Those who knew her would later remember her strange behavior in recent weeks, the way she had arranged her affairs with unsettling precision, the conversations about mortality that made everyone uncomfortable, the dreams about plane crashes described with prophetic accuracy. The radio crackles with static and concern. Nashville Tower calls repeatedly, but the storm is swallowing their words. At exactly 6:20 p.m., the Piper Comanche disappears from radar, vanishing into the Tennessee hills like a song ending mid-note. The wreckage will be found at dawn, scattered across a wooded hillside like broken dreams and twisted steel. But as rescue teams search through the rain-soaked darkness, radio stations across America begin an unplanned vigil, playing Patsy Cline's voice through the night, as if sound waves could somehow call her home. Sweet Dreams climbs the airwaves while the searchlights sweep the ground below. Her final recording becomes a ghost song, haunting frequencies that her physical voice will never touch again. The immediate news hits Nashville like lightning striking the Grand Ole Opry. Patsy Cline, the woman who survived poverty, abuse, and a near-fatal car accident, has finally met her match. But even as fans gather in shocked mourning, a question whispers through the honky-tonks and recording studios. Was this really just tragic timing, or had fate finally claimed a voice too dangerous, too honest, too powerful for this world to contain? The radar went quiet at 6:20, but across America the radio never did. To understand how a voice becomes immortal, we must travel back to where it first learned to fight the wind. To the poverty-stricken hills of Virginia, where a little girl named Virginia Patterson Hensley discovered that singing could make walls disappear. The year was 1932, and America was drowning in the Great Depression. In the microscopic town of Gore, Virginia, wedged between rolling hills that promised nothing but hardship, Samuel and Hilda Hensley welcomed their daughter into a world determined to break her before she could walk. Virginia arrived on September 8th with the first cold winds of autumn, and from her very first cry, neighbors swore they heard something different, a sound that carried further than it should have, cleaner than poverty allowed. Samuel Hensley was a man carved from disappointment, working whatever jobs existed to keep his family from complete destitution. Hilda, barely 20 and already worn down by worry, tried to create warmth in houses that had little heat and even less hope. They moved constantly, chasing cheaper rent and better opportunities that never materialized. Young Virginia learned early that stability was a luxury they couldn't afford, but she also discovered something miraculous. When she opened her mouth and let her voice fill the silence, The cramped rooms seemed to expand into cathedral spaces. By age 4, Virginia was already defying the limitations of her circumstances through sheer vocal power. When she sang along to the radio, neighbors would stop their work and gather outside just to hear that otherworldly sound drifting through thin walls. It wasn't just clarity or surprising strength for such a small child. It was something deeper, an understanding of heartbreak before she had even experienced it. Her voice carried honey over broken glass, sweetness that acknowledged pain without surrendering to it. The abandonment that would define her entire relationship with love came when Virginia was 7. Samuel Hensley, crushed by the relentless weight of poverty and responsibility, walked away one morning and never returned. No explanation, no goodbye, no promise to write, just a woman with 2 young children and bills that multiplied like weeds. The desertion carved a wound in Virginia's heart that would echo through every song she would ever sing, a fear that everyone she loved would eventually leave her standing alone. Hilda was forced into whatever work she could find, cleaning houses, factory shifts, anything that paid enough to keep them fed. Virginia learned responsibility before she learned to read properly, caring for her younger brother while their mother scrubbed other people's floors. But she also learned that survival required more than just endurance. It required the ability to transform pain into something beautiful. She would sing while doing chores, while turning dishwashing into opera and sweeping into symphony, performing for audiences of dust motes dancing in afternoon light. The poverty was crushing and constant. Some weeks they survived on biscuits and gravy, stretching every penny until it screamed for mercy. Virginia's shoes developed holes that she covered with cardboard, and her dresses were patched so many times they looked like desperate quilts. But instead of breaking her spirit, the hardship forged something unbreakable inside her. When the radio played Jimmy Rogers or the Carter Family, she didn't hear entertainment. She heard escape routes mapped in melody and verse. School attendance was sporadic due to their frequent moves and Virginia's need to help support the family. Teachers who encountered her briefly were struck by her intelligence, but formal education took a back seat to survival. Still, she absorbed everything around her like a sponge, particularly the music that drifted from radios, churches, and the coal miners who sang to make their dangerous work bearable. Each melody became part of her growing arsenal, each harmony another weapon against a world that seemed determined to silence her. The voice that would later mesmerize millions was being forged in these crucible years, learning to cut through chaos and command attention through sheer force of will and beauty. Even then, people sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary, though none could predict the heights she would eventually reach. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? The answer lay in her unwavering belief that music could transport her beyond any limitation, a belief that would carry her to the pinnacle of success and ultimately to her final flight into the storm. By her teens, Virginia Patterson Hensley had grown into the kind of young woman who could silence a room simply by walking into it, not because of conventional beauty, though she was striking, but because she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had survived the worst and emerged with her voice intact. The transformation from Virginia to Patsy began in 1948, when she was 16 and already performing in venues that generously could be called rough. The road to Nashville stretched before her like a promise written in broken dreams and false starts. Country music in the late 1940s was undergoing seismic shifts, with the Grand Ole Opry serving as both inspiration and intimidation for every aspiring performer. But getting there required more than talent. It demanded connections, luck, and the ability to survive in an industry that specialized in chewing up hopefuls and spitting them out without ceremony. Patsy's early breaks came through Wally Fowler's touring shows, where she learned that talent meant nothing without the ability to fight for it. Record executives told her she was too country for pop and too pop for country, a criticism that would later prove to be her greatest strength, but at the time felt like a creative death sentence. Her voice, with its distinctive vibrato and emotional honesty, refused to fit into existing categories. Some industry insiders were mesmerized, others found her unmarketable. The constant rejection could have shattered a lesser spirit, but Patsy had been forged in abandonment and poverty. A few Nashville executives weren't going to stop her now. The early 1950s became a grinding period of honky-tonk education. She performed in venues where audiences were more interested in drinking and fighting than listening to music. Learning to project her voice over breaking bottles and shouted conversations. These weren't glamorous stages, they were often dangerous places where a young woman alone faced threats that extended far beyond bad reviews. But Patsy developed a reputation for handling herself, earning respect through a combination of extraordinary talent and uncompromising toughness. Her first marriage to Bill Peer in 1953 became both her introduction to adult love and her graduate course in heartbreak. The relationship was volatile from the start, fueled by Bill's jealousy over Patsy's growing career and her frustration with his lack of ambition. They fought with the same intensity that she brought to her music, publicly, passionately, and without reservation. But these battles taught her something crucial. Personal pain could be transformed into artistic gold. Every argument, every moment of loneliness, every financial struggle became raw material for the emotional honesty that would define her recording career. The marriage also introduced Patsy to domestic violence, a horror that connected her viscerally to the women in her audiences who faced similar struggles. Bill's possessiveness escalated from verbal to physical abuse, trapping her in cycles that she recognized from her childhood observations of other families. But instead of breaking her, these experiences deepened her understanding of how music could speak for those who had no voice, how a 3-minute song could acknowledge pain that society preferred to ignore. Professional frustrations mounted alongside personal ones during this period. Record deals appeared and vanished like mirages, promises were made and broken with casual cruelty, and Patsy began to wonder if the music business was just another form of the poverty she had escaped, only dressed in prettier lies. She watched lesser talents receive contracts while her unique voice apparently proved too challenging for an industry that preferred safe, predictable sounds. But compromise was not in her vocabulary. While other female country singers adopted sweet, submissive personas designed to appeal to male audiences and industry gatekeepers, Patsy remained defiantly herself, strong, outspoken, and unwilling to be molded into someone else's vision of what a country singer should be. This stubborn independence cost her opportunities but gradually began attracting attention from those who recognized authenticity when they heard it. The breakthrough moment arrived in 1957 with Walkin' After Midnight, a song that crystallized everything she had learned about transforming personal devastation into public art. The recording wasn't just country or pop, it was something entirely new, a sound that would later be recognized as uniquely Patsy Cline. Producer Owen Bradley pushed her to explore emotional territories she had never accessed in a recording studio, demanding take after take until they captured not just her voice but her entire life story condensed into musical form. The success of Walkin' After Midnight changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Suddenly, Patsy Cline was a name people recognized, radio stations played, and audiences requested. But the personal struggles that had fueled the song continued unabated. Her marriage to Bill collapsed under the weight of her success, ending in divorce the same year her career took flight. The irony cut deep, just as she achieved the recognition she had dreamed of since childhood. Her personal life crumbled like a house built on shifting ground. standing alone in her dressing room after performances, staring at her reflection in mirrors that reflected success but couldn't hide the loneliness behind her eyes. Patsy began to understand the complex mathematics of fame. Every professional victory seemed to exact a personal toll. Every step toward stardom a step away from the simple human connections she craved. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? It was a question that would follow her through every triumph and tragedy that lay ahead, whispered by the wind she had spent her life singing against. The spotlight that found Patsy Cline in the early 1960s was hot enough to melt steel, and she stood in its center like a woman born for exactly this moment. The Grand Ole Opry stage stretched before her like a launching pad to immortality, and when she opened her mouth to sing, the very air seemed to shimmer with anticipation. At 28, she had transformed herself from a desperate young woman with dreams into country music's most commanding female presence, a force of nature wrapped in sequins and determination. Her remarriage to Charlie Dick in 1957 had provided the stability she craved, but stability in Patsy's world was a relative concept. Charlie was a printer from Winchester, Virginia, who understood he was marrying not just a woman but a hurricane with vocal cords. Their relationship burned with the same intensity she brought to every performance, passionate arguments followed by equally passionate reconciliations, as if they were trying to contain lightning in human form. The late 1950s and early 1960s represented the absolute zenith of her artistic powers. Songs like I Fall to Pieces and Crazy weren't merely hits. They were masterpieces that rewrote the rules of what country music could become. Her collaboration with producer Owen Bradley created a sound that was both deeply rooted in tradition and completely revolutionary. The lush orchestrations didn't diminish her country authenticity. Instead, they provided the perfect frame for vocal abilities that seemed to defy natural law. Crazy, written by an unknown Willie Nelson, became the song that defined her legacy before she even knew she was creating one. The recording session entered Nashville mythology. Patsy arrived with broken ribs from a recent car accident but refused to postpone the work. She sang the entire song while in considerable physical pain, and that suffering added layers of vulnerability to her already emotionally charged performance. Honey over broken glass. Sweetness that acknowledged every hurt while refusing to surrender to it. But success at this altitude came with oxygen deprivation that few people understood. The constant touring, recording, and promotional appearances left little time for the human connections that fed her soul. She was supporting not just herself and her immediate family, but relatives who had come to depend on her success like addicts depend on their next fix. The financial pressure was enormous, the emotional toll of being perpetually on even greater. The public Patsy Cline was confident, outspoken, and seemingly bulletproof. She mentored younger artists like Loretta Lynn and Dottie West, sharing hard-won wisdom about surviving Nashville's particular brand of beautiful brutality. Her generosity was legendary. She helped struggling musicians with everything from career advice to rent money, as if giving away pieces of her success could somehow protect her from losing it all. But those with access to her private moments began noticing cracks in the armor. Behind the dressing room door, away from the crowds that screamed her name, she would sometimes sit in profound silence, staring at her reflection with an expression that suggested she was looking for someone who used to live behind those eyes. The loneliness was becoming harder to hide, a growing sense of isolation that seemed to increase proportionally with her fame. Her marriage to Charlie was both anchor and storm system during this period. He was proud of her achievements but struggled with the reality of being married to someone whose career demanded everything she had to give. They fought about time, attention, priorities. The eternal conflicts of relationships where one partner belongs as much to the public as to the person they married. These weren't gentle disagreements but full-scale emotional warfare. battles that left both of them wounded, but somehow more connected than conventional harmony ever could have achieved. The material success was undeniable and overwhelming. Patsy was earning money she had never dreamed possible, living in a beautiful home, commanding respect from peers who had once dismissed her as too different to succeed. She had achieved every goal she had set when she first left Virginia as a desperate teenager with nothing but voice and determination. But the emotional mathematics didn't balance. Each professional triumph seemed to exact a personal toll, each step toward immortality a step away from simple human happiness. The songs she recorded during this period, while technically brilliant and commercially successful, carried a weight of sadness that hadn't been present in her earlier work. It was as if fame had given her the platform to express deeper truths about loneliness and loss than she had ever been able to articulate before. Her voice had always been able to break hearts, but now it seemed capable of breaking her own with each performance. The car accident in 1961 served as both wake-up call and prophecy. The crash left her with significant injuries and visible scars, but she insisted on returning to performing as quickly as possible, as if stopping might mean never starting again. Friends noticed that the accident marked a turning point in her personality. She became more reflective, more aware of mortality's proximity, more prone to conversations about death that made everyone around her deeply uncomfortable. She began speaking frequently about destiny and fate, conversations that carried an eerie certainty about her own limited time. These weren't the usual show business concerns about career longevity. They were deeper, more disturbing meditations on mortality that suggested she was receiving information from sources the rest of us couldn't access. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The question became more urgent as the pressures of fame continued mounting and the personal costs became impossible to ignore. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on June 14, 1961, carrying news that would reshape everything. Patsy Cline's car had left the road outside Madison, Tennessee, slamming into an oncoming vehicle with devastating force. The impact crushed her forehead, requiring extensive reconstructive surgery, and doctors couldn't promise she would ever perform again. For a woman whose face was as integral to her image as her voice, the prospect of permanent disfigurement was almost as terrifying as permanent silence. But the physical trauma was merely the visible wound. In the weeks following the accident, those close to Patsy witnessed a profound transformation that went far deeper than surgical scars. She became obsessed with mortality in ways that disturbed even her closest friends, talking constantly about death with an intensity that suggested she was receiving information from sources beyond normal perception. The dream started immediately. Vivid, detailed scenarios of plane crashes that she would describe with unsettling accuracy, as if she were watching previews of her own ending. The recovery period also brought devastating personal revelations. While she lay in a hospital bed fighting for her life and career, Patsy learned that Charlie had been unfaithful during her absence. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical injury because it confirmed her deepest fear. That love was always temporary, that everyone she trusted would eventually abandon her. The little girl whose father had walked away was now a grown woman whose husband couldn't remain faithful while she was literally fighting to survive. Professional pressures mounted even as she struggled to heal. The music industry's attention span was measured in weeks, not months, and there were immediate whispers that Patsy's career might be over. Radio stations began removing her songs from rotation, record executives started auditioning potential replacements, and younger female artists were positioned as the next generation of country music stars. The business she had fought so hard to conquer was already moving on without her, treating her like yesterday's news while she was still making headlines. The comeback, when it finally came, defied every medical prediction and industry expectation. Patsy returned to the stage with visible scars and a slightly altered voice. The accident had affected her breathing and changed her approach to certain notes. But rather than weakening her performance, these changes added new dimensions of authenticity that audiences found even more compelling. She had always been able to convey pain through her music. Now she carried that pain visibly, and the connection with her audience deepened to an almost spiritual level. However, success was now shadowed by increasingly erratic behavior that worried everyone in her orbit. Patsy began drinking more heavily, often appearing at performances intoxicated enough to affect her judgment if not her vocal ability. She became involved in public confrontations with other artists and industry figures, burning bridges that had taken years to build. Some attributed this to after effects of her head injury. Others believed she was simply unable to cope with fame's relentless pressures combined with personal disappointment. Alcohol wasn't her only form of self-medication. Prescription pain medication, initially necessary for her injuries, continued long after physical healing was complete. The combination of pills and liquor created a dangerous spiral that concerned everyone around her, but which she seemed powerless or unwilling to stop. She would later confide that the medication was the only thing that quieted the constant anxiety about death that had plagued her since the accident. Her marriage to Charlie became even more volatile during this period. Their fights were legendary throughout Nashville, often spilling into public venues and embarrassing mutual friends and colleagues. But they were also intensely passionate, and their reconciliations matched their conflicts in dramatic intensity. Those who knew them described a relationship that was simultaneously toxic and deeply dependent, as if neither could survive with the other, but neither could imagine existence apart. The strain began affecting her music in subtle but noticeable ways. While her technical abilities remained formidable, critics detected a new brittleness in her voice, a quality suggesting she was maintaining control through sheer force of will rather than natural ability. The vulnerability that had always been part of her appeal became more pronounced, but it was now tinged with desperation that made some listeners uncomfortable. Personal relationships outside her marriage suffered as Patsy became more unpredictable and demanding. Her friendship with Loretta Lynn remained strong, but other connections frayed as she developed a reputation for being difficult to work with. She seemed to be testing people constantly, pushing them away to see who would fight to stay close, repeating patterns of abandonment that had defined her entire emotional landscape. Most troubling was her growing preoccupation with premature death. She frequently told friends and family that she wouldn't live to see 35, predictions initially dismissed as post-accident trauma but increasingly disturbing as she repeated them with apparent certainty. She began organizing her affairs with unusual thoroughness, updating her will, establishing trusts for her children, writing letters that read like final goodbyes to people she loved. The dreams about plane crashes became more frequent and more detailed during this period. She would wake Charlie in the middle of the night, describing scenarios of aircraft disasters with accuracy that seemed impossible for someone with no aviation knowledge. She began refusing certain flights, claiming her dreams had warned her about specific planes or routes. Some friends started taking these premonitions seriously, though others dismissed them as anxiety manifesting in dramatic form. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems that had been building for years? The question haunted everyone who loved her as they watched a woman simultaneously reaching the peak of her artistic powers while seeming to prepare for an ending that only she could see approaching through the storm clouds gathering on her personal horizon. In the quiet spaces between performances, Patsy Cline found herself studying mirrors with a mixture of recognition and bewilderment. The reflection showed the same extraordinary performer who could command any stage, but something fundamental had shifted after the accident and betrayals. The scars had healed to thin white lines, but deeper wounds continued bleeding into every aspect of her existence, transforming her relationship with success, love, and life itself. The process of emotional reconstruction proved infinitely more difficult than any physical healing. Patsy began seeing a psychiatrist in Nashville, sessions she kept secret from everyone except her most trusted confidants. Dr. Margaret Morrison later described her famous patient as someone carrying an extraordinary burden of premature wisdom about loss and abandonment, a woman whose childhood trauma had created patterns that repeated themselves with devastating consistency throughout her adult relationships. Charlie's infidelity had reopened wounds that traced back to her father's disappearance decades earlier. In therapy, Patsy began understanding how that original abandonment had shaped every relationship since, how she unconsciously chose partners likely to leave or betray her because it confirmed what she had always believed about herself. The revelation was simultaneously liberating and devastating, offering possibilities for change while acknowledging damage that seemed almost beyond repair. Marriage counseling sessions reportedly matched their private arguments in explosive intensity. Charlie struggled to understand how his actions connected to patterns established long before they met, while Patsy fought to believe someone could love her without eventually walking away. The therapist's notes described two people who loved each other deeply but were trapped in behavioral cycles that seemed almost impossible to break without destroying the very relationship they were trying to save. Music became both sanctuary and torture during this period. On stage, she could transform her pain into something beautiful and meaningful, connecting with audiences on levels that transcended normal performer-audience relationships. But the emotional cost of that transformation was staggering. Each performance required her to deliberately access wounds that had barely begun healing, to channel pain she was simultaneously trying to overcome through sheer force of artistic will. Her relationship with her children, Julie and Randy, became increasingly complex as her touring schedule and emotional instability made consistent parenting nearly impossible. She would shower them with gifts and attention during brief periods at home, then disappear for weeks, leaving them with relatives or babysitters. The pattern created confusion for the children and compounded Patsy's guilt, adding another layer to her already overwhelming emotional burden. Professional relationships required careful navigation through this new emotional landscape. Her reputation for being difficult wasn't entirely unfair. She had become demanding and perfectionist to degrees that exhausted collaborators. But those who understood her circumstances recognized that the difficulty stemmed from desperate needs to maintain control in areas where control was possible, since she couldn't control her husband's fidelity or her father's long-ago abandonment. The friendship with Loretta Lynn became one of the few constants during this chaotic period. Loretta later described Patsy as someone carrying the weight of the world but still trying to help everyone else carry theirs too. The relationship provided something Patsy rarely experienced elsewhere: unconditional acceptance and understanding from someone who never asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was, pain and all. But even this precious friendship was colored by Patsy's growing obsession with mortality. She began giving Loretta personal items to remember her by, and frequently discussed what she wanted done with her music and legacy after she was gone. These conversations disturbed Loretta, who couldn't understand why someone so young and successful focused so intensely on death. But the discussions seemed to provide Patsy comfort, as if making arrangements gave her some measure of control over the uncontrollable. Drinking and prescription drug use continued despite various attempts to address these problems. Patsy cycled through periods of sobriety followed by relapses often triggered by anniversaries or particularly stressful events. She developed elaborate justifications for substance use, describing it as necessary for performance or as the only way to quiet anxiety that had become her constant companion. Those trying to help found themselves frustrated by her intelligence. She understood exactly what she was doing and why it was harmful, but felt powerless to change patterns that had become essential to her emotional survival. Religious faith, important to her in childhood, became complicated during this period. Patsy struggled with traditional concepts of God and forgiveness, unable to reconcile divine love with the pattern of human abandonment that had defined her experience. She continued attending church sporadically and found comfort in gospel music, but her relationship with organized religion remained troubled and inconsistent, another casualty of trauma that affected every aspect of her worldview. Perhaps most significantly, this period saw the emergence of what friends described as a new kind of fearlessness in both her music and life choices. Having survived the accident and subsequent betrayals, Patsy seemed to operate from the perspective that she had already lost everything that mattered most. This gave her freedom to take artistic and personal risks she might never have attempted otherwise, but it also contributed to increasingly reckless behavior that worried everyone who cared about her. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Patsy, the answer seemed to be that complete escape might be impossible, but transformation, however painful, remained always within reach. The question was whether she would have enough time to complete that transformation before the shadows caught up with her permanently. The year 1962 unfolded like a slow-motion farewell, as if Patsy Cline were simultaneously reaching the absolute pinnacle of her artistic powers while methodically preparing for an ending she seemed to anticipate with disturbing clarity. At 30 years old, she possessed the kind of mature artistry that most performers never achieve, but she carried herself with the weary resignation of someone much older, someone who had seen too much and felt too deeply. Her daily routines took on ritualistic qualities that spoke to her growing awareness of time's finite nature. Most mornings found her awake before dawn, spending an hour in complete silence with her coffee before beginning the complex business of being Patsy Cline. These quiet moments seemed essential to her functioning, as if she needed to gather strength from solitude before facing the relentless demands of public life. Charlie later recalled that interrupting this morning meditation could affect her mood for the entire day, suggesting how precariously balanced her emotional state had become. The children became both her greatest source of joy and her deepest wellspring of anxiety during this final period. Patsy was acutely aware that touring robbed Julie and Randy of consistent maternal presence, and she compensated with intensity that sometimes overwhelmed them. When home, she would spend entire days focusing exclusively on the children, as if trying to compress weeks of normal parenting into concentrated hours of hyper-attentive love. Her performances during this time were marked by a raw vulnerability that audiences found both mesmerizing and unsettling. She seemed to be singing not just songs but confessions, each number an opportunity to reveal truths she couldn't express in normal conversation. Critics noted that she had transcended entertainment and moved into something approaching spiritual experience, though they also observed that this intensity was visibly draining her physical and emotional reserves. The marriage to Charlie achieved a strange kind of stability during this period, not because their problems were resolved, but because both seemed to accept that turbulence was their natural state. They developed an unspoken understanding that their love existed alongside their dysfunction, neither likely to change significantly. Friends described a couple who fought and reconciled with equal passion, as if dramatic emotional extremes were essential to their connection. Professionally, her perfectionism reached legendary proportions. Recording sessions became marathons of artistic pursuit, with Patsy insisting on dozens of takes to find exactly the emotional truth she sought. Owen Bradley later described these sessions as exhausting but ultimately rewarding, as her instincts for lasting impact were usually flawless. However, this perfectionism extended beyond music into every aspect of her public presentation, creating unsustainable levels of control and pressure. Mentoring younger artists became increasingly important during this period. Beyond Loretta Lynn, she took interest in several emerging female performers, seeming to understand that her time to influence the industry might be limited. She shared not just technical knowledge but hard-won wisdom about surviving Nashville, maintaining artistic integrity while navigating commercial pressures, and understanding the personal costs of fame that nobody discusses during contract negotiations. Her financial affairs were organized with thoroughness that disturbed her business manager. Patsy insisted on updating her will multiple times, establishing detailed trust funds for her children, creating comprehensive instructions for catalog management after her death. When questioned about such unusual attention to estate planning for someone so young, she would simply say she believed in being prepared for any eventuality, though her certainty that preparation would be needed soon was deeply unsettling. The dreams about plane crashes became more frequent and more detailed during this final year. She would wake Charlie in the middle of the night, describing vivid scenarios of aircraft disasters with accuracy that seemed impossible for someone with no aviation knowledge. She began refusing certain flights, claiming her dreams had warned her about specific planes or routes. Some friends started taking these premonitions seriously, while others dismissed them as anxiety manifesting dramatically. Most telling was how openly she began discussing her legacy, speculating about posthumous impact and remembrance with the detachment of someone reviewing completed work rather than ongoing life. These conversations weren't morbid in tone but seemed to provide comfort, as if ensuring meaningful impact after death was more important than extending life itself. She spoke frequently about authenticity in art, about artists' responsibility to tell difficult truths, about hope that her music might help other women find their voices. The radar of her intuition was picking up signals that everyone else missed, warnings transmitted on frequencies only she could receive. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation, attempts to control at least the meaning of an ending she couldn't prevent? The distinction seemed less important to her than the certainty that whatever time remained needed to be used with complete honesty and desperate efficiency. As winter gave way to spring in 1963, those closest to her noticed she was saying goodbye in small, careful increments. Not dramatic farewells that might alarm people, but the kind of gentle conclusions that suggested someone putting their affairs in order with the thoroughness of someone who wouldn't be coming back to finish the job later. March 5, 1963 dawned gray and threatening across the Midwest, with weather services issuing warnings that would have grounded any sensible pilot. But Patsy Cline had never been accused of being entirely sensible, and she had commitments in Nashville that she refused to break. She had performed at a benefit concert in Kansas City the night before, a charity event for the family of disc jockey Cactus Jack Call, who had died in an automobile accident just weeks earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on her, performing for the family of someone killed in a crash, while her own dreams continued to whisper warnings about aircraft disasters. Her performance of Sweet Dreams that final night had left the audience in stunned silence, then thunderous applause. Several witnesses later said she seemed to be singing directly to death itself, offering the song like a negotiation or perhaps a surrender. The honey over broken glass quality of her voice had never been more pronounced. Sweetness acknowledging pain while refusing to be diminished by it. The morning brought the kind of weather that makes experienced pilots check and recheck their instruments. Storm systems stretched across multiple states, with reports of severe turbulence, lightning, and visibility near zero. Most commercial flights had been canceled, but Randy Hughes, her manager, who also served as pilot, assured her that his Piper Comanche could handle the conditions. The dual role created a conflict of interest that would haunt the investigation. Was he making decisions as a safety-conscious pilot or as a manager desperate to get his star to her next commitment? In the hours before departure, Patsy's behavior took on an otherworldly quality that disturbed everyone who witnessed it. She spent unusual amounts of time saying goodbye to fellow performers, embracing them with intensity that seemed disproportionate to normal farewells. To Dottie West, she said words that would echo for decades. "I've got a feeling about this trip, honey. If something happens, make sure my babies know how much their mama loved them." When pressed about what she meant, Patsy just smiled with the serenity of someone who had already made peace with whatever was coming. The letter found later in her hotel room was dated that morning but never sent. Written in her distinctive handwriting, it read, "Mama, don't worry if I don't come back from this one. I've lived more in 30 years than most people live in 80. The babies will be taken care of. Charlie knows what to do with the music, and I want you to know that every moment of happiness I ever had came from the love you gave me when nobody else would. Don't be sad for me. I got to sing, and singing was all I ever really wanted to do." The letter sat on her nightstand like a prayer written to comfort the living rather than prepare for the dead. The takeoff from Kansas City was delayed multiple times due to deteriorating conditions. But by early evening, there was a slight break in the weather. Hughes made the decision to attempt the flight, though weather services continued advising against all non-essential aviation. Patsy Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins boarded the small aircraft with a combination of eagerness to get home and uneasiness about the continuing storm clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly across their flight path. The final photograph ever taken of Patsy shows her climbing into the Piper Comanche, looking over her shoulder with an expression those who knew her described as both defiant and resigned, a woman who had spent her entire life singing against the thunder, now preparing to discover whether the thunder would finally sing back louder than she could match. At 6:07 p.m. Central Time, the Piper Comanche lifted off into gathering darkness, carrying 4 souls toward a destiny that had been written in Patsy's dreams for months. Radio contact was maintained for the first 90 miles, with Hughes reporting moderate turbulence but nothing beyond his experience to handle. The aircraft climbed steadily through layers of clouds, heading toward Nashville in what should have been just another routine flight for seasoned performers. At exactly 6:20 p.m., the last transmission crackled through the static. Hughes reporting his position as 90 miles southwest of Nashville, altitude steady but requesting updated weather information for his approach. The reply from ground control never reached them. After that moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that swallows voices whole and leaves only questions in its wake. The radar screen at Nashville Airport showed the Piper Comanche's blip disappearing somewhere over the hills of Tennessee, vanishing like a song cut off mid-note. But across America, radio stations began an unplanned vigil, playing Patsy Cline's voice through the night as if sound waves could somehow guide her home. Sweet dreams climbed the airwaves while searchlights swept the darkness below, her final recording becoming a ghost song haunting frequencies her physical voice would never touch again. The search began at dawn on March 6th, when the aircraft failed to arrive and no distress signal had been received. Rescue teams combed the hills and valleys of Tennessee, looking for any sign of the missing plane while radio stations continued their marathon tribute. The wreckage was discovered at 6:29 a.m. by a search team guided by a local farmer who had seen a flash in the sky the night before and heard what he described as the sound of thunder that didn't sound quite right. The Piper Comanche had crashed into a heavily wooded hillside near Camden, Tennessee, traveling at such tremendous speed that the impact crater measured several feet deep. Investigators later determined that the aircraft had been descending rapidly when it struck the trees, suggesting either mechanical failure or complete spatial disorientation that had caused Hughes to lose control in the storm. There were no survivors. Patsy Cline, at exactly 30 years old, had died instantly upon impact, along with Randy Hughes, Cowboy Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins. The official investigation concluded that Hughes had become disoriented in severe weather conditions and lost control of the aircraft, a finding that satisfied most observers but left haunting questions for those who knew about Patsy's months of premonitions and her eerie certainty about dying in precisely this manner. The news reached Nashville within hours, spreading through the country music community like wildfire. Radio stations immediately began playing her music in continuous tribute, and by evening, impromptu memorial gatherings were forming at the Grand Ole Opry and venues throughout Music City. The loss felt seismic, not just the death of a performer, but the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in American music that could never be reopened. The investigation raised technical questions that were never fully resolved. Weather was certainly a primary factor, but Hughes was an experienced pilot who had successfully navigated similar conditions many times. Aviation experts suggested possibilities ranging from wind shear to spatial disorientation, conditions that could cause sudden loss of control even for seasoned aviators. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the mechanical explanations. It was the prophetic accuracy of Patsy's dreams and predictions. The funeral on March 10, 1963, drew thousands to Winchester, Virginia. Country music luminaries served as pallbearers, and the service featured performances by Nashville's biggest stars, though many were too overcome to complete their songs. The most poignant moment came when Loretta Lynn attempted Sweet Dreams and broke down completely after just a few lines, her collapse seeming to capture the broader sense of irreplaceable loss that Patsy's death had created. But even as her body was laid to rest, her voice was achieving a kind of immortality. Sweet Dreams climbed to number 5 on the country charts posthumously, and her catalog began selling in numbers that exceeded anything achieved during her lifetime. Radio stations reported overwhelming requests for her songs, and record stores couldn't maintain stock of her albums. It was as if the public was desperately trying to hold on to whatever remained of an extraordinary voice that had been silenced forever. The personal effects found in the wreckage told their own story. Along with expected items, investigators discovered a small notebook containing what appeared to be lyrics for new songs, fragments dealing with mortality, love, and acceptance that seemed to confirm she had been preparing emotionally for her death. One incomplete verse read, "When the last song's been sung and the final bow is made, don't cry for the music that's been played. Every note was chosen, every word was true, and the silence that follows can be beautiful too." As initial shock faded, questions emerged about whether the crash had been as accidental as it appeared. The suspicious circumstances, flying in dangerous weather despite warnings, recently updated wills, the disturbing accuracy of her premonitions, led to conspiracy theories about possible industry pressure, insurance fraud, or other factors that might have contributed to the tragedy. While no credible evidence of foul play ever emerged, the theories reflected deep suspicion about an industry's treatment of vulnerable artists. More serious questions centered on Randy Hughes's decision-making process. As both manager and pilot, he faced potential conflicts between safety concerns and professional obligations to get Patsy to her scheduled television appearance. Some wondered whether she had somehow influenced the decision to make the flight, driven by the same fatalistic impulses that had governed her behavior during her final months. The official conclusion of pilot error, compounded by severe weather, satisfied most authorities, but left nagging doubts among those who had witnessed her increasingly prophetic behavior. Had she somehow known what was coming and chosen not to prevent it? Or had the dreams and premonitions been elaborate manifestations of guilt and self-destructive impulses that ultimately became self-fulfilling prophecies? But perhaps the specific cause matters less than the undeniable impact of her brief, brilliant existence. In 30 years, she had transformed from a poverty-stricken child in rural Virginia to an international icon whose influence would echo through generations. Her voice, with its unique combination of vulnerability and strength, had given expression to emotions that countless people felt but couldn't articulate. She had proven that country music could be both commercially successful and artistically uncompromising, opening doors for female performers who would follow her path. The legacy was complex and multifaceted. Triumph over adversity balanced against cautionary tales about fame's personal costs. Both aspects would prove influential in shaping how subsequent generations understood the relationship between artistry and personal fulfillment, between public success and private happiness. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? The question continues resonating decades later, not because of credible evidence of conspiracy, but because Patsy's life had been so marked by patterns of loss and abandonment that even her death seemed to fit a narrative of tragedy too perfect to be purely coincidental. Perhaps some lives are simply destined to burn brightly and briefly, leaving illumination that continues long after the source has been extinguished. At 6:20 p.m. on March 5, 1963, radar lost Patsy Cline. At 6:21 p.m., America found her forever. Today, more than 60 years after her voice was silenced, Patsy Cline continues to haunt the American consciousness with power that seems to grow rather than diminish with time. Her recordings, the sacred quartet of Crazy, I Fall to Pieces, Walk In After Midnight, and Sweet Dreams, have achieved immortality that few artists ever attain. These weren't just songs that captured a moment in country music history. They distilled universal human experiences of love, loss, and longing into 4-minute miracles that speak as directly to contemporary audiences as they did to listeners in 1960s Nashville. The immediate seismic impact of her death on country music created a void that seemed impossible to bridge. Female performers working in her shadow suddenly found themselves trying to fill space that defied measurement. Loretta Lynn, perhaps the most obvious inheritor of her mantle, spent years deflecting comparisons while developing her own distinctive style. "Nobody could be another Patsy," Lynn said decades later. "The best any of us could do was try to be ourselves as honestly as she was herself." This became the template for country music's approach to her legacy, not imitation but inspiration toward greater authenticity. The crossover success she had achieved almost accidentally became a roadmap for subsequent country artists seeking broader audiences without sacrificing their essential identity. Her ability to maintain country authenticity while appealing to pop sensibilities demonstrated that artistic integrity and commercial success weren't mutually exclusive. Artists from Dolly Parton to Shania Twain to Taylor Swift have followed paths that Patsy first blazed, though none have quite matched the effortless way she moved between genres without ever seeming to compromise her core identity. Perhaps most significantly, her influence on female empowerment in country music cannot be overstated. In an era when most female country singers were expected to be sweet and submissive, she was strong, outspoken, and unafraid to express complex emotions that challenged conventional expectations. She sang about desire, independence, and heartbreak with equal conviction, creating space for women to be fully human in their artistic expression. The direct lineage from Patsy Cline to contemporary artists like Miranda Lambert, Casey Musgraves, and Maren Morris is undeniable and profound. But the legacy extends far beyond country music's boundaries. Jazz vocalists study her phrasing and emotional delivery techniques. Pop singers attempt to capture her vulnerability without her pain. Rock performers admire her ability to project strength and fragility simultaneously, often within the same phrase. Her influence can be heard in artists as diverse as Norah Jones, Alison Krauss, and Adele, all of whom have cited her as inspiration for their own approaches to conveying authentic emotion through song. The posthumous commercial success of her music has been extraordinary and sustained. Greatest hits compilations have sold millions of copies across multiple generations, and her songs continue finding new audiences through movie soundtracks, television shows, and streaming platforms. Crazy alone has been covered by more than 200 artists, from Willie Nelson, who wrote it, to Diana Krall, to K.D. Lang, each discovering new emotional territory in the song that Patsy made immortal through her definitive interpretation. The myths and mysteries surrounding her life and death have contributed significantly to her enduring fascination. The uncanny accuracy of her premonitions about the plane crash has never been satisfactorily explained, leading to ongoing speculation about everything from supernatural prescience to subconscious self-destruction. The combination of tragic early death and extraordinary talent has placed her alongside cultural figures like James Dean and Marilyn Monroe, artists whose premature endings seem to crystallize their legacies at moments of greatest impact. Academic studies of her work have revealed layers of complexity that weren't fully appreciated during her lifetime. Musicologists have analyzed her unique vocal techniques, particularly her distinctive use of vibrato and her ability to convey multiple emotions simultaneously within single phrases. Literary critics have examined her song choices and their relationship to personal experiences, finding patterns suggesting sophisticated understanding of narrative and character development that went far beyond simple entertainment. Cultural historians have positioned her as a pivotal figure in American popular music's evolution, a bridge between traditional and modern approaches that help define what popular music could become. Her willingness to blur genre boundaries and her refusal to be categorized created template for artistic authenticity that continues influencing performers decades after her death. The impact on Winchester, Virginia has been profound and lasting. The Patsy Cline historic house draws thousands of visitors annually, and the city has embraced its connection to the legendary singer as source of both pride and economic development. Her grave at Shenandoah Memorial Park remains a pilgrimage site for fans worldwide, many leaving flowers, letters, and photographs as tokens of continuing connection to her memory and message. The technological revolution in music distribution has only amplified her reach exponentially. Streaming platforms introduce her voice to listeners who weren't born when she died, and her songs regularly appear on playlists dedicated to everything from heartbreak to empowerment to artistic authenticity. Social media has created global communities of fans who share interpretations of her lyrics and personal connections to her story, keeping her memory vibrantly alive in ways that would have been impossible in previous eras. Modern country music's relationship with her legacy remains complex and sometimes contentious. Purists argue that contemporary country has abandoned the emotional honesty she represented, while others contend that today's female artists are fulfilling the promise of independence and authenticity she embodied. The debate itself testifies to the continuing relevance of questions she raised about balancing commercial success with artistic integrity. The mystery of unrealized potential continues fascinating fans and critics alike. At 30, she was entering what should have been the peak of her artistic maturity. Songs she was writing at the time of her death suggested new directions in both style and subject matter, hinting at depths of experience and understanding not yet fully explored in her recorded catalog. The loss of that potential future remains one of the most poignant aspects of her tragedy. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Patsy Cline's legacy is how her voice continues providing comfort and understanding to people experiencing their own struggles with love, loss, and identity. Her ability to transform personal pain into universal art remains as powerful today as 60 years ago. In a world that often values style over substance and image over authenticity, her commitment to emotional truth feels both rare and essential. Honey over broken glass, sweetness that acknowledges pain without surrendering to it. The question haunting her legacy isn't whether she would have continued evolving as an artist. Her intelligence and curiosity suggest inevitable growth, but whether the pain that fueled her greatest art would have eventually consumed her even without the plane crash. Friends from her final months described someone simultaneously at peak creative powers and near the end of emotional resources, suggesting the crash may have prevented a longer, more complicated story of struggle and survival. The radar went quiet at 6:20 p.m. on March 5, 1963. But across America and around the world, the radio never did. Her voice continues singing through frequencies that transcend time and technology, carrying truths that connect us to the deepest parts of ourselves we sometimes forget exist. Patsy Cline didn't just sing songs, she sang souls, ensuring her voice would echo through eternity, as timeless and essential as heartbreak itself, as enduring and necessary as the human need to transform pain into beauty, silence into song.